Hello and welcome to the Pandemic Papers, an interview with Dr Rachel Clarke for Good Grief Festival. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you, Rachel. It's lovely to see you again.
Hello, thanks Lucy, it's lovely to be here.
I don't think Dr Rachel Clarke needs that much of an introduction. I'm sure everyone watching will know who she is. But just to say briefly before we start, so my name's Dr Lucy Selman. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Bristol, and I'm the founding director of the festival. And Dr Rachel Clarke is an author and a doctor specialising in palliative medicine. Before going to medical school, Dr Clarke was a television journalist and a documentary maker, and she now helps patients live the end of their lives as fully as possible. Dr Clarke continues to write and appear in the media to share her experiences and expertise, using the power of human stories to build empathy and inspire change. She's also the author of 3 books: the best-selling Your Life in My Hands, about being a junior doctor on the NHS frontline; Dear Life, which is based on her work in a hospice and her own grief after her father's death. And I was delighted to talk to Rachel about Dear Life at the last festival in October. And the new book, Breathtaking, which we'll be discussing today, and I have a copy of it right here. And it came out in January, so it's now available. So Breathtaking is quite an astonishing book. So it's an unflinching insider's account of medicine in the time of coronavirus. Drawing on testimony from her colleagues as well as her patients, Clarke argues that in this age of contagion, we've really seen a profound attentiveness to and gratitude for what matters most in life. So Rachel, thanks again for joining us today to talk about Breathtaking. I wonder if we could start at the beginning and I could ask you why you wrote this book.
Yes, well, it was not intentional initially. I think when this all began just over a year ago, like everybody, I was pretty shocked, traumatized by what was unfolding. I mean, that applies to the whole population, not just those of us in the NHS. We were clearly entering something cataclysmic. And I was incredibly anxious even before lockdown began about the delays, the inertia, the fact that there were hospitals in London declaring critical incidents, completely running out of ICU beds even before we had locked down. And when I'm stressed, I don't sleep. So I used to get up, pace around the kitchen, make myself cups of tea, try not to wake up my husband, and I tend to bash away on my keyboard when that happens. So initially I was just bashing away, and it wasn't for publication, it was just for me really. And entering the first wave was incredibly traumatic for many reasons for most of us. So again, I used to type away, and then gradually after the first wave had subsided, I found that I did want to do something with all of that bashing away, and I wanted to keep on writing and trying to express and articulate what it had been like, because I thought it was important to try and document that first-hand testimony. And I interviewed patients, families, other healthcare workers as well to try and do that, because I believed there was a story that had unfolded inside our hospitals that wasn't necessarily what the public knew or had heard, and it seemed valuable to document that.
And Breathtaking covers the first 4 months of last year, doesn't it? So I think what really struck me about it is that reading it a couple of months ago, it can almost already feel like quite a long time ago, like this sort of distant world where we didn't know that much about coronavirus, and everything was changing so fast, and this kind of new evidence and knowledge was kind of coming out very slowly from different parts of the world. And I think you described that so well. And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about what it was like being a clinician with awareness of public health and sort of seeing the pandemic unfold in China and in Italy.
Yes, it was astonishing. I mean, in no sense would I ever pretend I'm an expert, I'm a public health expert or an epidemiologist. But what we were seeing first in Wuhan, in China, and then in northern Italy was absolutely terrifying. I remember sharing, all of my colleagues, my medical colleagues, sharing on the 6th of February the image of a Chinese doctor called Li Wenliang, who became a kind of viral sensation because he was a Chinese whistleblower. He just before the new year, he sent a warning to his colleagues on social media, a private warning saying, this is a real and deadly virus, and he was punished by the Chinese authorities for doing that. Subsequently caught the virus he had tried to warn his colleagues about, and then went to intensive care and then died from it. And we were sharing this image, a selfie taken by this young doctor who was only in his early 30s, completely healthy, taken in intensive care a day or two before he died. And that sent real spine tingling sensations down us all. And then, of course, in Italy, suddenly this threat that had seemed as though it was on the other side of the world was now on our doorstep. And if you remember, in half-term weeks, that was the week when suddenly we were seeing images from Italy that you could never imagine would happen somewhere so close to us, of hospitals overrun, ventilators being rationed, hospitals running out of body bags, of oxygen. And at the same time, probably a lot of us knew people who may have gone away for half term, and some of them had gone to Italy. And I think then, and this was still a full month away before lockdown, lots of us in the medical profession were thinking, this is coming here, and are we really prepared? Because I'm hearing lots of soft word music from the government about how well prepared we are, but actually, are we? We're an NHS who has been through 10 years of austerity budgets. It's incredibly run down. We all knew that our number of intensive care beds in Britain was a third of the intensive care beds in Italy. So how on earth were we going to avoid this unfolding disaster?
And I remember at that time, there was almost a sense that we were different in the UK and somehow it wasn't going to affect us in the same way. I remember at the very beginning, you know, the way it was reported in the media, there was still that sense of distance, wasn't there? Which I'm sure, I'm sure that wasn't the case for clinicians, or many clinicians must have been very scared already at that point. But I think among the public, there was this sense of, you know, it may not get that bad here.
Absolutely. And I think that the public was explicitly encouraged to be relaxed, to be complacent, by a prime minister who, in March, on the same day that our COVID action plan was launched on the 3rd of March, he also at a press conference was asked whether he would wash hands, and he made a joke about the fact that he had been in hospitals recently and was shaking hands with everyone, including COVID patients. Now we knew at that very time that the first patients with COVID were being seen and treated in a cluster of hospitals, and the paramedics, the emergency doctors, the ICU doctors who initially received some of these patients were wearing full hazmat suits, so they were covered from top to bottom. And the notion that our Prime Minister could have been claiming live on national television that he was swaggering around, complacently shaking hands with these patients, was just startling. I remember watching that live and almost wanting to scream at the television, because we all knew that in a public health crisis, particularly a pandemic and infectious disease, the only way a country will ever get through that safely is together. You're relying on human behavior and the public behaving in ways that avert disaster. But we seem to be getting a message that it was okay to maybe laugh at this, joke at this, it wasn't serious. And of course, a few days later, the Prime Minister made quite a song and dance on social media of bravely going and spending Saturday afternoon in the crowds at Twickenham with his fiancée, cheering on England in a rugby match. And again, we clinicians were tearing our hair out, because the message that was sending out was, don't worry guys, you can relax, this is nothing to worry about.
And just to stay for a while on this topic of what it was like for clinicians at that time, what really struck me was the sort of fear and danger of working clinically during the pandemic, and especially in those early stages when there was shortages of personal protective equipment and services were really struggling. And I just wanted to read this short section which describes 4 clinical staff preparing to intubate a patient with COVID-19. So you write, they're huddled like supplicants around the bed, these 4 staff peering down on one patient. It's intimate to the point of claustrophobia. Even the air they share belongs to them and them alone. For the 5 are sealed inside a room, especially designed to sequester infections. It's negative pressure drawing in air from outside while clinging to its own contaminated vapours. That air, of course, reeks of invisible danger. Every surface and every one of the gowns and masks they wear will be thickly coated in particles of coronavirus. And as they work, each team member is managing the fear that the person whose life they're trying to save may yet be the death of them. I found that so powerful, just at conveying what it must have been like to be working in those circumstances. And I wondered if it was a kind of explicit aim of the book to sort of help those of us who weren't in working in hospitals or hospices to sort of try and understand that.
Very much so. And I think what I was struck by in that first wave, and in a sense for the whole of the last year, was this enormous gulf between the world that I was inhabiting inside the hospital and then this, to me, peculiar, strange, eerie, locked down world outside. And I would see newspaper articles about the tedium of lockdown, the frustrations of having nothing to do every day being the same, of everybody starting to bake bread as though they could somehow bake their way out of the crisis. And I was really struck by how alien that world was for me, because I inhabited another alien world that was invisible and unknown to everybody outside, because hospitals were closed. You only got inside if you were a member of staff, a patient, or occasionally the family member of somebody who was judged to be dying very close to the end of life. Other than that, this world was barricaded away from the public. And I wanted in the book to try and open those doors and take the reader inside with me so they could really see and almost experience and feel what we were feeling through my eyes and the eyes of my colleagues. And that seemed valuable, because otherwise, how do we know recent history? How do we know any other person's experience if we're not shown it? And if we're not shown it, then it's somehow invisible. It may disappear from view. Lots of people talk about the fact that with the great pandemic, the flu pandemic of 1918, there are no memorials. There is very little historical evidence from that time, because it was invisible. It wasn't like a war that unfolded dramatically with tanks and machine guns and trenches. And I wanted to try and cross the divide and take the reader with me. And it's hard to remember now, because we've lived through so much news in the last year, but then there were no vaccines. There wasn't even a dream of a vaccine. There were no treatments. This was a completely new disease. Doctors were finding out as they went how to treat people, and almost everything we were learning in the early stages was bad. It wasn't a disease that just affected your lungs. It affected your heart muscle, your brain, your blood. People started dying from strokes and blood clots. And all of that information was being discovered real time by clinicians who were up against conditions of unimaginable, overwhelming workloads. And I wanted people to know, really. I wanted to try and give voice to the people who were inside.
And you were working in the hospice at the beginning, weren't you? Could you just explain what happened to you personally in terms of your clinical practice? Because I know you then went and started working at the hospital as well.
Yes, well, I work in an amazing small hospice in North Oxfordshire called Catherine House Hospice, and it's quite a typical independent hospice. It has an inpatient unit, a ward with 10 beds, where normally we're looking after some patients who have arrived for end-of-life care, so they will die with us, and some patients who are coming for us to help them with their symptoms. So they may come with pain from a cancer, and we will work with them and find out the best way to get them feeling as good as they possibly can, and then they'll go home again. So I started the book on the 1st of January last year, when I was at work on New Year's Day, on call and caring for my usual patients. And when the pandemic began, I was desperate, like so many of my friends and colleagues, to be doing the most useful thing I could. And I wanted to be where the patients with COVID were. And I particularly wanted to try and use my palliative care skills with patients who we knew, because we were seeing it in China and Italy, were going to be dying in their droves from this disease in hospital. So I wasn't in intensive care, but I was on the normal wards of the hospital, which is where around 90% of the patients in hospital did indeed go on to die from COVID. And so I spent some of my time at the hospice, some of my time in the hospital, caring primarily there for patients with COVID.
And I think I just wanted people to understand, I suppose, your personal context and where you were working at this time. Because one of the things that really struck me in the book is how you weave in your own stories of sort of having to manage that gap, as you described it, between sort of working clinically and then going back to your family. But also how you talk about your colleagues' struggles with that too. So Laura, for example, the ICU nurse, having to decide whether to go and visit her own father in the ICU, knowing that she was working in a sort of high-risk environment. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that aspect, the sort of dealing with the personal impact of working in those sort of dangerous contexts and your fears around taking it back to your family or potentially infecting somebody else.
We were all scared. I think probably we're all happy to be open about that. Of course we were scared. This was a disease which wasn't just claiming the lives of our patients, it was claiming our lives as well. So in my hospital in Oxford, 2 porters lost their life to COVID, a nurse lost her life, and an administrator lost his life. So 4 deaths from COVID, and we are convinced that at least 3 of those individuals caught their COVID in hospital. So very quickly, NHS staff were in a situation where they were going into work, caring for patients with the same virus that they knew had caused their colleagues to now be lying themselves intubated on a ventilator in intensive care, fighting for their life and indeed dying from this disease as well. Again, even before lockdown was finally declared back in March last year, we knew, it wasn't in the public domain, but we knew of doctors who were now intubated with this virus in intensive care before lockdown. And that was tremendously difficult, and it coloured your day-to-day life, because I think if you go into healthcare, you do it, of course, because you want to help people. So your instinct is always to move forwards, to step up, to go in, to try and be close to someone who is vulnerable or suffering and help them. But at the same time, you had to reconcile that with another instinct, which was to flinch back, to flinch away, because you were scared and you knew that your proximity to this patient who needed you could also be the thing that would endanger your own life, and potentially which you would carry back into your family and thus endanger the life of, in my case, your husband or your children. And all of that would have been hard enough, but it was also compounded by the fact that for a great many people, they didn't have the right PPE at the start of the pandemic. They didn't have any PPE, some people, and some of the doctors and nurses who died from COVID in the first wave openly and publicly on social media were begging for the right PPE before they caught COVID and died from it. And I think that's one of the many things that haunts me to this day, and I think always will.
I think as you talk about that, what really strikes me as well is your role as an individual, in that you have been advocating for the NHS and for better access to PPE, and trying to hold the government to account for certain decisions they've made during the pandemic. How did you manage that? I mean, how did you manage to do so much, I suppose? It seems like you took on such a huge role yourself personally.
Again, rather like the book, not by design. I think sometimes if you're a doctor or a member of the NHS and you speak out, you criticise the government for some of its decision making around the NHS, for example, then you may be accused of being a political activist, someone whose party politics conflicts with your role as a doctor. But I think always from the moment I became a doctor, I'm not really interested in party politics, but I'm deeply, deeply interested in trying to support, excuse me, I'm catching your cough, Lucy, trying to support patients who fundamentally are vulnerable people. All patients are vulnerable, in getting the best and safest care they possibly can. And if that's your motive, then it's very easy for you to feel as though your day-to-day work as a doctor also spills over into a more public realm of trying to speak out when you think it's important. In the NHS, we are meant to have an absolutely sacrosanct duty of candour. We are meant to be honest always with our patients, and that's critical for establishing a bond of trust with your patient in front of you and with the wider public. And so I felt last year a compulsion to speak out. It wasn't a choice. When I knew, for instance, that the government ministers who were standing up saying there are no problems with PPE supply, everybody is getting what they need, no one is put in danger, but I was receiving desperate phone calls and messages and emails from people who were saying to me, we haven't got the right PPE, please help us, please do something, please get this out. I didn't really choose to do something about that. I felt I had no other choice. And to my mind, speaking out about these things when they're important, whether it's regarding the safety of patients or staff, that's just an extension for me of my duty as a doctor. And I won't pretend juggling all of that has been easy at all. It's been a year that's left me feeling pretty broken in some ways, just the sheer exhaustion of working with patients in a pandemic and speaking out and writing about it. I sort of feel a bit like I've been running at 1,000,000 miles an hour for a year, and that's unsustainable. And I'm also not pretending that's the right way to behave. Maybe you could argue it's better to keep your head down and just focus on the patient in front of you. But I suppose I've just tried to say what needs to be said because it's true. And there are many, many ways to suppress the truth, ranging from trolling on social media or smearing someone as being a sort of party political activist when they're not, or actually at an NHS-wide level, centralised NHS England comms deciding very early on in this pandemic that no hospital, no trust was allowed to speak about the pandemic to journalists without first going through central top-down NHS England comms. And I know, excuse me, having spoken to sometimes trust CEOs, people at lots of different levels, that they were enormously frustrated about that at times. They wanted to be communicating with the media and they couldn't because of a very draconian comms policy. And I'm just not going to abide that. I'm going to speak out if I think it matters, because I guess I'm a former journalist. I believe in the power of free speech.
Well, I know that a huge number of people, and myself included, are really grateful for everything you've done, in speaking out. So although I can understand the sort of personal impact must have been really hard at times, I hope you do feel like it's been also valued by everyone around you.
I think yes, and sometimes, I mean, it means so much when someone does say thank you for trying to speak out on behalf of people who maybe whose voices aren't being heard. And I guess one of the things that has struck me all the way through this pandemic is who holds the stage. We've literally had government ministers, scientific advisors standing on a podium, televised every night, dictating the next day's news headlines. Who else has held court in this pandemic? Who has had a powerful voice and whose voices are being marginalised or excluded or silenced? And just to give one example, at this time last year, we know tragically what was happening. Many, many thousands of patients were being cleared out of NHS hospitals and sent back to the care homes from where they had been admitted originally without necessarily a COVID test, because this time last year, it was sometimes taking 3, 4, 5 days for a COVID test result to come back. So what were hospitals to do? How on earth could they keep all of these patients waiting for a negative test before discharging them? And actually, if they did so, then those patients may in fact be infected with COVID while waiting for the test results. So a rock and a hard place. But the fact remains, these patients were being sent back to care homes where they infected everyone else. And here we are a year later with over 40,000 care home residents having died from this disease, and this all taking place at a time when voices on the podium were saying, we are absolutely protecting Britain's most vulnerable members. We have a plan. Care homes have everything they need. Of course, they have PPE. And it was all a pack of lies, an absolute pack of lies. So I think by nature, I don't like it when people are vulnerable and silenced, or their voices aren't heard, they don't exist, they're pushed to the margins. And I think it's so important to try and advocate in those circumstances.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I did want to stick on this topic a little bit longer because as you described, there was this sort of rhetoric of cocooning the vulnerable and shielding the vulnerable. But at the same time, there was this rhetoric and the words of herd immunity that started being talked about around this time last year. And I think there are some concerns, aren't there, that certain members of the society were sort of cast onto a scrap heap in the name of this idea of herd immunity. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that and the effect that may have had on you as a clinician.
Yes, absolutely. I guess one of the reasons I chose to specialise in palliative medicine is precisely because my group of patients with terminal illnesses who are often very close to the end of life, are a particularly vulnerable group, even within the bigger vulnerable group of patients per se. And there are other groups like that, people with disabilities or mental health problems, or maybe the very elderly. There are certain groups that are particularly vulnerable and not always heard from. And patients who are close to the end of their life, there are many reasons why they're not always heard, because they're exhausted, they're trying to cope with a disease that's breaking their body down, and their focus is their loved ones, their families. Usually it's not speaking out, even if they did have the energy. And it's very easy for those patients to get lost in a chaotic, overstretched, understaffed health system and care system. And what struck me last year was, in a similar way, that the focus, the quite ruthless focus almost, on a particular group of patients. And that was the patients who were young enough and healthy enough and robust and strong enough to be able to go to intensive care and receive a ventilator and be given those very invasive treatments that might save their life from COVID. And in one sense, of course, that should be the focus. Of course, we want to save those people if we possibly can. And it's a tragedy if they could be saved, but their lives aren't saved because we haven't got enough ventilators or oxygen or ICU staff. However, what struck me from very early on was the fact that this focus, which was all about the doing, all about the saving, it was the sort of sexy, high-tech end of medicine, seemed to be occurring almost at the expense of a much bigger group of people. And this was the people who were far too frail or unwell or elderly ever to be able to go to intensive care and be put on a ventilator, because they simply weren't robust physically enough to cope with that aggressive form of treatment. And who was thinking about those patients? So these were the patients I cared for on the wards of the hospital. Many elderly, not always elderly, and they died from COVID in the same way, in waves, over and over and over again. And it didn't feel as though the public narrative was including those patients. There was rhetoric about shielding the vulnerable and we will definitely protect them. But the reality was no one was protecting them, and resources did not seem to be directed at this huge group of patients. And worse than that, in the middle of May, when that terrible phrase herd immunity first entered the public consciousness, and it didn't mean what it had prior to that point meant in medicine, which was herd immunity that was acquired through the medium of a vaccination. You vaccinate enough people against a deadly disease so that everybody becomes protected by the general immunity of the herd. This was a much more chilling form of herd immunity. This was a form that entailed, by definition, mass loss of life, because it was an idea that said, we will allow this disease to run through a population. Maybe we can't stop that happening, and we will accept that by the time immunity of the herd arrives, a certain proportion of the herd will have been culled. And when that phrase entered the public consciousness just over a year ago, people were rightly appalled by it, because it seemed to be a somewhat I want to say eugenicist, and that's probably too strong, but certainly a very brutally utilitarian approach that said, in our calculus, we are going to accept that in society now, in British society, we have two tiers of people. We have the small cohort of people that we're going to throw all our energies at protecting, whose lives are worth saving, and we have another cohort who are second class. We are going to sacrifice them. We are going to accept that a certain proportion of that group are expendable, they are going to die, and we will take that on the chin. And I thought that was repellent. I thought it was absolutely abhorrent. I know that there are trade-offs between the economy and a nation's health, and clearly the risks of locking down and genuinely protecting that vulnerable group were significant. But to have as an approach an opening gambit with this virus built into your calculations, the idea that tens, maybe thousands of people are going to be sacrificed, their lives will be expended because they're in that second tier of less valuable members of society. What an abhorrent principle.
Yeah, thank you. Really important reflections. And it's so important, I think, that we don't forget that time and that those words were used. I think that's one reason why your book is going to be such a valuable record of exactly what happened then. Just building on this, associated with this idea is also anxieties and fears about the use of do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation orders. And we saw stories in the media about these do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation orders being applied to groups of people rather than discussed individually with people and their families. And most recently, the Care Quality Commission report, which came out about this. I wondered if what your thoughts were on this.
So at the time, when these stories first emerged last year, they entirely understandably caused an enormous amount of public fear and anxiety, not least because these stories emerged in the context of that phrase, that sinister phrase, herd immunity, already being out there, with all the implications of that phrase for a group of British citizens being expendable, being thrown to the wolves. So I think, of course, the public was anxious. And we know from the CQC, the Care Quality Commission's investigation of this issue that was the results of which were published a couple of weeks ago, that this time a year ago, it was absolutely the case that a small number of clinicians, GP practices, were either applying a blanket do not resuscitate order to all of the residents of a single care home, for example, or they were deciding to impose a do not resuscitate decision on a particular patient without discussing it first with either the patient or their family, or they were just letting the patient or their family know that they had done this and sort of announced it as a fait accompli. And all three of those actions were and remain terribly, terribly wrong. It is always the case, both in law and in good medical practice, that a discussion around resuscitation, CPR, should take place ideally with the patient themselves. If it's not possible, then with the patient's next of kin, family, the person who's been appointed as their power of attorney, except in very, very exceptional circumstances. And that just didn't happen. And I've reflected really deeply on this and how damaging I think it has been for trust. And what I would say is, I suspect that the individuals who did this were not actually at all of the mindset that these people could be sacrificed. I find that very hard to believe. I suspect what was actually happening was they were under a lot of pressure from above, and certainly directives were coming from above very emphatically that patients, this needed to be addressed, do not resuscitate, very proactively at this time, because people were so worried about hospitals being filled up and overwhelmed. But also, I suspect that clinicians were trying in a clearly misguided way, almost to protect patients from what they thought might be a horrendous end of life. So we know, for example, that if you take an average 85-year-old, there are many, many 85-year-olds who are not robust and physically strong enough to be able to cope with ventilation. We know that for many 85-year-olds, you could put them onto a ventilator, but you'd never be able to get them off the ventilator again, because they wouldn't have the physical reserve to be strong enough to ever breathe for themselves again. And that's because from the moment someone is on a ventilator, the muscles that are responsible for their breathing start to deteriorate, they start to slacken. So already it's going to be a tall order to get them off the ventilator again. And for those patients where it might be right not to consider either resuscitation or a ventilator, there's a real question over whether or not coming into hospital is the right thing. We knew that every patient who came into hospital who went on to die was going to do so not only never seeing their loved ones perhaps in person again, but also literally never seeing another human face again, because every single person around their bed would be wearing a mask and a visor and be alien. And that's a very traumatic kind of end of life. That's the sort of end of life that lots of us fear, to be surrounded by machinery and chaos and bleeping and bedlam. So I suspect that the clinicians who are making these absolutely inappropriate do not resuscitate orders perhaps were motivated by the best of intentions, perhaps were panicking, perhaps were feeling overwhelmed, perhaps felt as though they had no other option. None of that makes it right at all. It's wrong. And I am so sorry on behalf of the health service that this happened. But I hope that the public might feel confident to know that, for instance, certainly in my experience, I don't know doctors who take the job, the responsibility of making do not resuscitate decisions lightly at all. This is someone's life you are thinking about, and the vast majority of doctors will do their absolute best to make those decisions in discussion with patients and families as equals, and they will take the weight of that responsibility incredibly seriously.
There's also a part in your book where you talk about discussing wishes for future care with patients in the hospice, and I think you make a really important point there, that actually care planning, when done well, is a really important feature of trying to ensure good end-of-life care. And you say here, forcing a ward full of patients with terminal illnesses to consider dying even more prematurely from coronavirus cannot in any sense be construed as kind, but it is, I would argue, respectful. Not having the conversations may avoid a degree of distress, but at the cost of denying our patients their agency. And I just wanted to bring that point up as well, because in a way, with all the, the shock and the, in some ways, horror of hearing these inappropriate uses of do not resuscitate orders in the media, it can kind of almost cloud or cover up the fact that actually having these conversations about what matters most to us is actually really important, isn't it?
Yes. And we know that in 21st century Britain, death and dying is a taboo subject. A lot of us find it very hard to talk about. And advanced care planning, thinking ahead to how would you like things to be if the worst happened, if you were diagnosed with terminal cancer, or if you caught coronavirus at home and were faced with the prospect of going into hospital and maybe having ventilation or CPR if your heart arrested. We don't do that. Around 6% of us have an advanced care plan. It's a very tiny proportion. And I guess I believe that in every crisis, every catastrophe and upheaval, good things emerge, extraordinary positives flourish through the trauma and the darkness. I think of antibiotics arising directly from the Second World War, for example. And I think that with COVID, whether we like it or not, death has been thrust centre stage for the last year. That's been traumatic. It's been unimaginably painful for the 150,000 families who have lost someone to COVID in particular, but for everybody who has lost someone this year, grief has been complicated by the loss of all of those rituals of mourning, funerals, wakes, people supporting each other in person through hugs and embraces. All of that being denied has made it so unimaginably hard. However, if in the future more of us could think ahead about our wishes should the worst happen, and maybe even sit down and tell your husband or your wife or your mum or your daughter what those wishes are, then isn't that a tremendous positive to come from this dark time? It's a real opportunity to make sure that the patient and their wishes are at the heart of end of life planning as much as life planning, and it would ensure that in the future there is a better chance of people not just living their life in the way they wish to, but actually living through the end of their life in the way they would wish to. So maybe one or two people listening now will have a cup of tea and have that chat with their families after this talk, and how brilliant for other people to know their wishes.
Thank you, I agree. And there are some resources on our webpage, Well Resources webpage, that people can look up if they want to explore the idea of having those conversations and recording their wishes more formally as well. I'd like to turn now to some of the questions that have come in from the audience. We've got some great questions here. We've got a whole kind of group of questions around supporting healthcare workers. Obviously, clinicians have had such a difficult time over the past year. So Laura here asks, how might we make emotional support easily accessible to professionals impacted by their exposure to working in the COVID era?
Really important question. We already have quite a bit of research on this issue, and we know that huge numbers of healthcare professionals, not just in intensive care, but across hospital and community settings, are experiencing either symptoms of PTSD or depression or profound debilitating anxiety as a result of what they've witnessed. And to some extent, there are resources in place to support those staff, and hospital trusts, for instance, have made a real effort to put some resources in place for traumatised staff, but it's not enough. And I would dearly love the government, for instance, to announce this year that all of those staff who they lauded triumphantly throughout the last year as heroes, as angels, they stood on the steps of Downing Street and clapped them. Well, how about some hard action to match the public intensity of their appreciation to the cameras? How about a huge injection of funds that is ring-fenced specifically to supporting a deeply traumatized workforce? As it is, we are entering now a phase where we hope very much this second wave will continue to abate and we will be getting back to business as usual in the NHS. But of course, it isn't usual. Staff are exhausted. I think everyone I know wishes they could take a month off and stay in bed for a month. How about resources to back up that talk of appreciation and those claps? And the other thing I'm conscious of is the fact that we now have literally millions of patients on waiting lists for elective surgeries in very important procedures, surgeries that should have happened throughout the last year, but couldn't because we were so overwhelmed by COVID. And that's really difficult because those same traumatized, exhausted staff are going to be expected to step up, crack on, and deal with that backlog. And again, there needs to be resources applied to supporting the NHS traumatised workforce, genuinely supporting them to address this backlog. And it requires funds. It doesn't require talk is cheap, it's easy, it requires funding and resources. And actually, I believe that perhaps at the moment, the greatest tribute that the government could make to all of the people who have died from COVID and their grieving families. So I'm talking about the 150,000 people who have died from COVID, and well over 1 million people who will be deeply affected by grief as a result of those deaths. I would like to see resources directly focused on that population of over 1 million grieving people. We have got thousands of counsellors, grief psychologists, therapists able to deliver therapy through Zoom in their homes at the moment. They could be funded to do that now. And that seems to me as though it would be an incredible way to try to help the healing of the country after this traumatic experience. So if I were Prime Minister, I'd be standing up on a podium and announcing that tomorrow, and it would have millions and millions of pounds behind it.
Thank you, Rachel. And this question you've just touched on, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So 1 year in, do healthcare staff feel thanked for their contributions and work that they've done for the past year?
Without a shadow of doubt, one of the things that got us through the first wave was this incredible, spontaneous outpouring of gratitude and appreciation from the public. I mean, it meant so much, you can't imagine. So often, as I drove home on the motorway and then pulled into the village where I live and saw the rainbows and the signs and the little pictures that kids had drawn and stuck up in their windows saying, "Thank you, key workers," I would literally cry. They would just make me cry because they were so beautiful. And when somebody donated 50 pizzas to A&E and you knew that they had done that, actually it was often Adam Kay, the author, who did this because he lives close to my hospital, but members of the public would just gift pizzas or donuts or just little beautiful little kind, generous acts of appreciation to staff. It meant everything, and we knew how real that was, and we know now, a year later, how absolutely genuine that appreciation is, and it means everything. It keeps you going. It's just magnificent. It's a tragedy that alongside that, from around September last year onwards, there was also a very vocal minority of people who started explicitly attacking NHS and care staff for having the temerity to say that COVID was real, it was deadly, and we had to take it seriously. So from around September last year, I started getting the most horrible abuse on social media. I would be called the most disgusting things: Harold Shipman, Satan, a devil. I was threatened with rape. I was threatened with death. I literally had death threats on social media for warning people that COVID was real, and that was absolutely horrible and traumatic for anyone in the NHS. But at the same time, we knew that was a tiny minority. We've always known that the public loves its NHS, and it means so much. The government, I'm a little bit more cynical. I think that if you want to bathe yourself in a kind of populist glow, the way to do that is to champion the NHS heroes rhetorically, but that's not actually the same as really showing your appreciation through actions. Actions are what count, and the actions, very sadly, at a government level, so often seem to say precisely the opposite. We would simultaneously be lauded as heroes while literally not being able to get the right PPE or not being able to be tested for COVID in hospital because there were so few tests at the time. So I'm ambivalent about that form of praise, but the public gratitude means everything, and it is one of the things that I will carry with me to the day I die. It's just been amazing.
This next question asks, I've seen references to moral injury and soul wound in the context of supporting healthcare workers. So I suppose this is referring to the phrase sort of moral distress as well. Could you say something to explain these, please?
Yes, they're both very powerful and I think absolutely accurate phrases. The idea of moral injury originates from a battlefield setting, and it originally referred to the psychological experience of soldiers who found themselves embroiled in some kind of deeply traumatic incident, or they found they bore witness to, I don't know, the bombing of civilians, for instance, in the name of war, and they were powerless, impotent to stop that happening, and it caused them profound psychological damage. It then started to be used in reference to healthcare settings where, for whatever reason, you find yourself in a situation where something deeply and profoundly troubling, morally troubling, is unfolding, and you as a healthcare worker are powerless to stop this. For instance, patients dying on trolleys in corridors every year in the NHS because there aren't enough beds, there aren't enough staff, and you as a clinician desperately want to do the best you can for these patients, but you can't stop them lying in distress, screaming on trolleys and corridors because you're just one doctor, you're powerless. COVID sort of supercharged that experience. We were all unable to give exactly the care we wanted to patients. There were patients dying in A&E, on wards and intensive care, who didn't have their loved ones at the bedside, and that felt profoundly wrong, who did not receive the very highest quality of care we wanted to give because there weren't enough of us, and that felt wrong. And it is one of the things that I think has caused so much of the trauma that healthcare staff are now experiencing, this awful sense of trying your absolute hardest but not being able to even remotely care for the patients in the way that you would like. And it's something that I think it's really valuable that we are talking about it. Trauma can't be suppressed. It lives on in your body as well as your mind, and it needs to be confronted safely, perhaps in the context of a therapeutic relationship through some kind of therapy with a counsellor or a psychologist, because if it isn't, it festers and it eats away at you. There was a time myself when I was trying to go to work in this January, and the second wave was so much bigger and grimmer and more desperate than the first, and it was so traumatic to be in it for the second time. And I was driving to work, and suddenly my body mutinied. I started feeling as though I was having a heart attack. I couldn't breathe. I had chest pain. I had to pull over by the side of the road. And although I was trying mentally to get to work, I literally sort of had to sit clutching my chest and crying hysterically because of the sheer overwhelming prospect of facing again the same conditions. And that is moral injury, and you grit your teeth, you pull yourself together, you go on, you go into the situation again because you have to support your patients, but it comes at psychological cost. And a lot of NHS doctors, nurses, porters, carers, every member of the wider team are going through something like that as a result of their experiences during the last year.
I think we've got time for just one more question. So what's been the most important lesson for you through all this?
I am hopeful now, and I believe that hope is not at all the same as wishful thinking or blind optimism. Hope has to be rooted in the way the world really is, not wishful thinking, not the way you want the world to be. And over the last year, I have seen horrible things, terrible things, traumatic things, but I have also seen literally every single day at work. Human nature at its absolute best. People, whether they're members of staff or patients or families, facing impossible adversity with the most extraordinary strength and courage and resilience and kindness and basic human love. I have been lucky enough to see that on a daily basis, and somehow all of that has been flung into even sharper relief by the backdrop of darkness and horror of a pandemic. And so I have seen the best of human nature, and I come out of this year a bit battered, a bit traumatized, really desperate for a haircut right now, but actually fundamentally, profoundly and deeply moved by how utterly extraordinary this frail, flawed, hopeless, miraculous, brilliant, beautiful thing a human creature is. I am astonished by humanity and what it contains, and that is what I take forwards in March 2021, still in lockdown, but profoundly hopeful, because people are good. They are incredibly, miraculously good, and we have seen that in this last year.
Rachel, thank you so much. I think those are really wonderful words to end on. A huge thank you for everything you've done over the past year and for joining us today. And everyone at Good Grief just sends you so much love and thanks.
Thanks, Lucy, very much.